Welcome back to Keep Your Hebrew. Today we are on day 18 of 30 days of Isaiah, and we'll be looking at the first servant song in Isaiah chapter 42, verses 1 through 4. There are 4 servant songs in the book of Isaiah. Their chapter and verse numbers are listed here for you. Jeff Grogan points out that there may be a possible misnomer here in that it's not entirely clear if these songs were ever meant to be sung, as it were. Another thing that's worth pointing out is that not every occurrence of my servant refers to the Messiah. And for a clear example of that, you can look at this section here in Isaiah chapter 42, verses 18 through 22. And what we see there is that God says, "My servant is blind." So he can't possibly be referring to the Messiah in that section. So do the servant songs refer to corporate Israel or the Messiah or both? So Craig Blomberg suggests that it is plausible to imagine that Isaiah had both individual and corporate understandings in mind from the outset. And there's more ambiguity at the beginning in Isaiah 42, but as we move on in the servant songs, as we progress through the servant songs, we'll see more and more that it's pointing towards a specific individual who is going to be responsible for the redemption of Israel. With that, let's take a look at the first 2 verses. Isaiah chapter 42, verses 1 and 2. Hen avdi et mochbo, bahiri ratzeta nafshi, natati ruchi alav, mishpat lagoyim yotzi, lo yitzak, velo yisa, velo yashmiah, bachutz kolo. Okay, let's work through the translation. Behold, my servant, and there's maybe an implicit relative pronoun. Behold my servant whom I uphold. This is a resumptive pronoun. My chosen, whom my soul favors. I put my spirit upon him. Justice to the nations he will bring out or bring forth or proclaim. He will not cry out, and he will not lift or cause his voice to be heard outside. And here's the parsing for Yashmiah. It's a he-fill imperfect 3ms of Shama. So cause to be heard. Moving on to verses 3 and 4. Kane ratzutz lo yishbor, ufishta cheha lo yechabena, le'emet yotzi mishpat, lo yeche velo yārûṣ, ad yasim ba'aretz mishpat, ulatorato yim yeyachelu. Okay, let's translate this. A crushed reed, kane is reed, rāṣaṣ is, or rather rātzutz is a cal passive participle, masculine singular of rāṣaṣ. A crushed reed he will not break, and a faintly glowing wick he will not quench. This is a lamed of manner. So according to faithfulness, in faithfulness, faithfully, he will bring forth justice. He will not faint. And notice the same root here. He will not faint. And he will not yārûṣ. We'll take a moment later on to figure out what yārûṣ means. On the surface, kind of like sight reading, you might think it means run from the verb roots. But I'd like to get us to think a little bit harder about that. So let's just keep that blank for the moment, and we'll go back to this later. And he will not something until he sets in the earth justice. And for his law, the distant coasts, that's Iyim, the distant coasts or the coastlands, the distant coasts will wait. So yachal means to wait. So let's do a little textual criticism of Isaiah chapter 42 verse 4 to figure out what yārûṣ means. In the Septuagint, the word used for yārûṣ is traustesitai, and that's a future passive indicative 3s of thrao, which means to break or to cause to break. And because this is in the passive, it means and he will not break, or he will not be broken. So the Septuagint reads, and he will take flame. So it's a positive way of saying he won't flicker out, he won't burn out, he won't faint. He will take flame, and he will not be broken until he sets on the earth justice. And in his name, the Gentiles or the nations will hope. So this is from El Pizzo. And you'll notice that there isn't the sigma that conveys the future tense. And that's because the principal part for future tense for El Pizzo is LPO. So this makes complete sense. Now, what do we do with this? How do we figure out what yārûṣ is? So there's two main ways that arrive at the same meaning in the end, but there's different linguistic explanations. So let's consider both ways. So the BHS amends yārûṣ to yērôṣ. So it turns it into a nifal imperfect 3ms of rāṣaṣ, and it keeps rāṣaṣ. It doesn't try to change it to another verb, and there's a good reason for this, because we've already seen that yehe matches the adjective that we saw earlier, keha, and it's very likely that there's a similar kind of parallelism happening between rāṣaṣ and yārûṣ, that they're both from the verb rāṣaṣ. Okay, so if we come back to that explanation, what the BHS editors are saying is it's likely that the Masoretes pointed it wrongly, that they should have pointed it as a nifal imperfect 3ms of rāṣaṣ, but they didn't. There's a second explanation, which is from Motyer, and he cites Gesenius's grammar and a similar form in Ecclesiastes chapter 12 verse 6 to say that we shouldn't change yārûṣ, that yārûṣ is exactly in the form that it should be, and it takes an intransitive reading, which means to bruise. In other words, yārûṣ means you get bruised or you get crushed rather than you bruise or crush something else. And in my opinion, I favor number 2 over number 1, simply because I think it's more likely that the Masoretes knew exactly what they were doing in Ecclesiastes 12 verse 6 as well as in Isaiah chapter 42 verse 4. It's more likely that they knew what they were doing in both instances than that they made the same schoolboy error in the same 2 instances. And so, in light of that, how should we translate yārûṣ? You can say something like, he will not faint, nor will he be crushed or be bruised till he sets in the earth justice. And what's the significance of this? This means that there's hope for bruised reeds and flickering wicks like you and me. George Matheson represents this really well in this verse from his hymn, O Love That Will Not Let Me Go. O light that followest all my way, I yield my flickering torch to thee. My heart restores its borrowed ray, that in thy sunshine's blaze its day may brighter, fairer be. That's all for today. See you again tomorrow for more on 30 Days of Isaiah.